Good morning, everybody. I'm Fabio Borghetti. I work at Polytechnic di Milano in Mobility and Transportation Laboratory. And today we will talk also about the effect about what we discussed before. So I will not talk about avalanches, model, and so on, because it's not my. But I think that the models and the studies that are presented before are very useful and suitable for us to understand and to highlight the possible effects on transportation network when a big event, when a relevant event can occur. And so the idea now is to show you how it's important to talk about critical transport infrastructure and how to manage relevant events, major events that can affect the transportation infrastructure as road, rail, and so on. I like to start the presentation with some events that happened all over the Europe, not in the area of the CONPROVA project, just to understand what are the possible impacts. And when I say impacts, it means not only the direct impacts in the place when the accident occurred, when the event occurred, but also in a wider area. This event happened in 2017 in Rastatt, Germany. And there was only a little event that involved the railway. But this railway represents a very important corridor in Europe just to connect the north and south for freight transport. And what happened? Okay, more than 50 days of closure. And what was the economic impact about the closure? About 2 billion. So try to imagine what are the possible social effects all over the Europe if you close a section of a railway that will cut the Europe into parts from north to south. This is just an example. Then we have another event that happened in Switzerland, okay, not in Canton Grigioni, but in Switzerland, in the A2, that is, let me say, the backbone of the Switzerland. And the debris flow happened on the highway. And also in this case, the consequences are not related in the section where the event occurred. And in fact, we can see that the highway was closed for more or less 20 hours, but we have larger social impacts that was about 20 million, just to manage the mobility in the zone. We have another event that happened in 2023 regarding the railway tunnel, the Freius railway tunnel, that you can see in the image. And also in this case, this is an important corridor between Italy and France. And the closure was more or less 90 months. And then try to consider what are the effects, the economic effects between the two countries in terms of 200 millions. Okay. And the last one is again in Switzerland about the Gotthard-based tunnel. After a derailment of the train, there was the closure of the West Tube more than a year. Okay, so no natural events only. This is a non-natural event. It is, let me say, man-made event, anthropic event. But also in this case, Gotthard Tunnel represents a very important corridor in Europe for passenger, for freight transport. And you can see the impacts about 220 million. So this is just an example to understand how it's important to study the possible effects that can be linked and related to transportation infrastructure. Here is let me say, the agenda of my presentation, and then we can start with the resilience and emergency management in transportation. As I said before, it's important to consider that nowadays our society is very, very strongly dependent on the specific systems and infrastructure that are interconnected. We have, for instance, transportation, we have energy, we have information technology, and water networks. All these systems work together. And then you can see in this graphical representation how is important to check that everything can work, because a disruption, also a little disruption, can provoke a domino effect in our system. And obviously, these systems try to imagine what could happen in case of blackout, the electric power. There is a cascade effect, not only in transportation, but also in waters and so on. And then these systems are necessary for the functioning and operation of each country. I mentioned the resilience before, but now I think it's important to try to provide the possible definition of resilience. Also in literature, there are a lot of possible definition of resilience. We use resilience in engineering transport, but the term resilience comes from another disciplines, psychology, sociology, and so on. Now we use resilience in our sector, engineering. And then what we can say about resilience, we can have, for instance, a relationship between two important elements, the time, as you can see here, and the performance of our system, in which we have the first step in which everything is okay, then something happens, the event, and then you can see the typical trend. Decreasing, then stable again, and then recovery. So the four phases are very, very important, because the four phases can help us to understand and to study resilience, and to evaluate also what are the possible measures that can be adopted. Also, the first one, preparedness, in which everything is okay, is the most important phase in which we have to study what we presented before without emergency, and that apply all the outputs of our study to cope, to face the emergency situation. And then we can see, for instance, the loss or vulnerability, so what is the behavior of our system during the event, during the emergency? Or, for instance, the robustness. How is able our system to respond, to cope during the situation? And the rapidity. If I'm able to put on the table resources, knowledge, awareness, shared resources, shared knowledge, and so on, I can increase the rapidity and reduce the recovery time. This is just to understand how is important what we said before. And the idea is to push up the trend, okay, to reduce the loss, and move left the curve to reduce the recovery time. This is our goal, and this goal can be reached also taking into account the studies that was presented before. Just 4 questions to understand what is behind the resilience and emergency management. So first of all, what can happen when a relevant event occurs in a given area? What are the socioeconomic impacts or effects taking into account the events that I have presented before? Who manages a relevant event? And finally, what could happen if we are talking about a cross-border area? And now it's important to underline that in this case, we need a decision support tool, instruments that can support the decision-making process in order to manage the transportation system in a easy way. So the first question, we have, for instance, the activation of first responders, firefighters, sanitary rescuers, and so on, operation and managers like ANAS, agencies, institutions, prefectures, civil protection, it depends, but there are a lot of stakeholders that are involved. Implementation of plan and procedures that must be activated, taking into account the specific event, okay? Because each plan, each procedure is referred to a specific event. And then we have to manage the mobility and transportation system, not only in the place, not only in the area where the event occurred, but also in a wider area, just to ensure, just to grant the mobility of goods, for instance. The point is everyone is effective in their own area of expertise, but when we are all around the table, we speak the same language, for instance, but maybe we have to understand what is behind the language in terms of plan and procedures, in terms of rules, for instance. Second question, what are the possible socioeconomic impacts that we have already seen before, but must be also evaluated in the area where the accident can occur? We have to consider also that we have different kind of socioeconomic impacts. Take into account, for instance, freight transport, the tour of to alternative routes, delay in the supply chain, and so on. Also, effects to passengers, travel time, alternative lines and routes, if available. It depends on the situation. It depends on the topology of our network, obviously. Environmental impacts, increased road traffic, for instance, increased CO2 emission or air pollution. Depends of the link of the section that is disrupted. And then we have also indirect costs that are not easy to be evaluated because it's not easy to monetize these costs. But you can see that we have, for instance, impacts on local tourism, increasing in accidents due to alternative routes, and so on. So all these impacts are very important when we have to consider, okay, there is an event here, but the consequences are not only related to in the place where the event occurred, but also in a wider area, as I said before. What are the subjects? What are the stakeholders involved? We have, for instance, firefighters, first responders, firefighters, sanitary experts, policies, and so on. We have agencies as institutions, operators, managers, and so on. And it's very important, the relationship among all the subjects involved. Because, okay, we have to speak the same language, Italian, English, whatever you want, but we have to have in mind a clear idea about the activation of the procedures. And finally, the last one, if we are working in a cross-border area, so we have many stakeholders involved, as we said before, obviously, but in some cases, we have different rules and processes due to the 2 countries or 3 countries involved. It depends on the configuration of the system under investigation. Then we have prolonged impacts and effects on the 2 or 3 countries, okay, as we said before, in a wider area. And the point is, we want to try to merge and share resources just to reduce the intervention time and just to improve and increase the possibility to reduce the effect. So we want to put all the resources on the table and work together to cope the event. And then we can say something about the possible solution that we can adopt in terms of the tools, the useful and suitable tool that can be used to manage an event. The critical infrastructure platform can be a possible tool. And in fact, in this slide, you can see some keywords that I mentioned before, just to understand what does it mean when we talk about resilience, emergency management, transportation, effects, impact, and so on. And the idea, okay, all these keywords can be put inside a critical infrastructure platform. The platform comes from the previous one, Interreg project, the resilience of cross-border critical infrastructure. That was a project between Regione Lombardia and Canton Ticino, the north of Regione Lombardia and the south of Canton Ticino. You can see the partner involved, Regione Lombardia, Polizia Cantonale, Cantonal Polizei, Dipartimento del Territorio, Polytechnic di Milano, and SUPSI. The project ended more or less 1 year ago, and then you can see the main important data of the project. So, what is the heritage of this project? We want to take the platform that is already in operation, and we want to boost, to improve this platform, take into account the specific needs within the CONPROVA project. So in this way, We start from what we have done in the previous one project, and then we will improve some specific tools. This is the platform that is already in operation, then you can try to assess and so on. And then, for instance, we are now upgrading the transportation network because you can see here the sixth project road network in gray. And then now we are implementing the CONPROVA project road network, taking into account the extension in the cantonic regioni, obviously. Now, so before the network was only referred to the Canton Ticino, now we have to extend the network on the Canton region. And then you can see the CONPROVA road network divided by the two countries, okay, in purple and for Switzerland and in blue for Italy. And then the same approach will be used also for rail transportation. Now we are starting upgrading the road transport, and then we will upgrade also the rail transportation. What about transportation infrastructure? As I said before, we have to consider road transport and rail transport. And the point is what can happen. So what can happen and what are the possible consequences after a big event, after a major event. We can consider on one end events caused by transport system in which the source of risk is within the transport system itself. Road accidents, rail accidents, dangerous goods transport, for instance. And on the other side, the events in which the source is external to the transportation system, as natural hazard, for instance, that we discussed before. But the effects are also within the transportation system itself. And here we can see in the slide the main features, the main elements of the critical infrastructure platform. Communication, to communicate, to display, and to simulate. So these are the main features that are already in the platform, but will be implemented better now within the CONPROVA project. I just want to underline an important issue that is behind the platform, because the platform is a starting point. It means it's not a static platform, but it is always in evolution, because we want to satisfy the specific needs that will arise from stakeholders. So the idea is, okay, now we have specific resources and time to develop the platform, but for the future also the platform will be developed by taking into account specific needs. And we don't want to replace the current and official channels between within each stakeholder. So firefighters will use specific channels, police will use specific channels, but the critical infrastructure platform can merge all these channels and try to make the communication easier than the use of the phone or other tools. Here we will have just a very, very fast presentation about the critical infrastructure platform, but I don't want to take more time because this is just very, very summary in which we can see the architecture, the structure of the platform that is divided in two main parts. The left part is the collaborative emergency management that is useful to share information between the different subjects involved. On the right side, we have the geography that is suitable and useful to understand something on the map. And the two modules are already in operation, and then you can see some examples in terms of cameras, monitoring network, alerts, and so on. And then we can see something about the collaborative emergency management, in which we have, for instance, the alerts. Okay, we have a specific tool that can support the management of alerts. So the user can put some data, and this data will be shared with other subjects. Then we have the events in which there is an emergency. I an emergency that can affect a critical infrastructure, a transportation infrastructure, road or rail, and then we have to put some information about what happens, and this information will be shared among the subject involved in the situation, first responders, operators, prefectures, civil protection, and so on. And then we have, for instance, scheduled activities in which we have no emergency situation, but for instance, I have to close a road section or a tunnel for maintenance. So it's important to understand this information before the event, just to organize alternative routes. For instance, this part was very, very important in the previous one project, in which there was the border between Italy and Swiss. When the border was closed, for several reasons, it's important to have an idea when the border is closed, because Italy must manage the traffic and also Switzerland must manage the traffic. Italy must manage the traffic starting from the south of Lombardy region, and Switzerland must manage the traffic starting from Zurich node. Okay, so in this way, the border between Italy and Switzerland is very important, also if there is no emergency situation. Then we have the geographic viewer, in which we have a lot of possible tools, and in particular, we have two bars. In the lower part, we have a bar that is suitable to show something. So there are a specific widget that can help the user to show something, starting from the camera, alerts, maps, and so on, that are in the platform. And then in the upper part, there is another set of, there is another bar with other tools that are able to simulate something. So with these tools, the user can simulate something on the network and understand the behavior of the road and rail network during an event. We calculated also specific resilience indices on the rail and the road network, just to understand the behavior of the network during an event, okay, and in particular before and during the joint response of the event. And then we can see how these indices are calculated, but I think we have not enough time now to make a deeper analysis, but if you are interested, maybe I can explain before. We mapped also the possible resources that can be activated during an emergency, starting from the procedures and plans that I said before. So there is a map, and the map can be activated by the user just to understand where are located these resources and to estimate the intervention time when there is a big event on the map. Here there is a typical output of the indices. It is an index related to the road network. We used colors in which green represents a good situation. Then we have yellow, orange, red, and dark with the bad situation in terms of resilience. And then the same approach would be done also for rail transportation, in which we use the same colors to classify the road network. Then there is another important tool that can be useful to manage the mobility of passenger and freight transport during an emergency. And you can see that there are a lot of possibilities for the user to switch on, switch off alternative routes, and then the user can see what is the alternative routes in case of a disruption of road section or rail sections. And this situation can be useful also to share the information to the other subject involved when there is a disruption in a specific route. And now we are going on with this tool, and we are improving this tool, adding new features. So it's important also to consider the new specific needs within the CONPROVA project. There is a last tool that is referred to the dangerous good transport. It is a typical event that can affect transportation system. It is a man-made event but generally is a typical event because it requires more time to be solved. And it means that the closure of the infrastructure, road or rail infrastructure, will be prolonged during the time. So it means that the tool is able to make some evaluation in terms of the possible damage area, take into account the scenario. And in particular, the tool allows to evaluate what are the possible targets within the area. For instance, schools, hospital, commercial center, and so on, and how to reach this area for the rescuers, and how to evacuate this area if we have, for instance, school, hospitals, or other point of interest or elements that must be evacuated. So this is another important tool that is already in operation inside the critical platform. What about the conclusion? So I try to make some conclusion using this diagram because this diagram is a good summary of my presentation. Within the CONPROVA project, we have to consider the possible causes, starting from natural avalanches and so on, that can affect the resilience of our system. And in particular, the resilience can be divided in 4 phases, okay, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And in this way, we have to work in each phase in order to how to improve the resilience itself for road and rail transport. So it's important to start from the causes that can affect our system and take into account the 4 steps, the 4 phases of resilience. We want to try to provide solution to simplify the emergency management that can affect transportation network. So that's all from my side. If there are